Terry Boykin spent 40 years making sure nobody around him ever felt the weight of his disappointment land on them. This is the story of how a black Gen X man who built a life around not being a burden, a son from a laid-off steel town, a father, a piano tuner who makes broken things sound whole again, reached a point in his 50s where he simply stopped absorbing everyone else's discomfort. It traces where that habit came from, what it cost him, and what changed the day he finally let a note ring flat. Terry Boykin has one rule when he strikes a tuning fork: he lets it ring itself out. He never grabs it to stop the sound early, even when the room is quiet enough that the hum feels too loud. He was standing in a stranger's dining room in Shaker Heights when his phone buzzed against the piano's cabinet, his sister's name lighting up the screen for the fourth time that month. He already knew what she needed before she said it, and he already knew what he used to say. For 30 years, yes came out of Terry before he'd even finished hearing the ask. This time he set the fork down, let the last of its hum fade into the piano's open lid, and typed back 4 words: "Can't do it, sis." Then he put the phone face down on the bench and kept working, which was the part that surprised him more than sending the text. Terry is 58, and for most of his adult life, disappointing somebody felt like a kind of failure, a note landing wrong in a room where everybody could hear it. Now it barely registers, and that shift, quiet, unglamorous, almost invisible from the outside, is the whole story. People who have known Terry for 20 years will tell you he's one of the most dependable men they've ever met. The guy who shows up early, remembers your kid's recital, never leaves you hanging. Those same people, if you press them, will also tell you something happened to him somewhere in his 50s, that he got different, a little harder to reach, quicker to say he can't make it. Both things are true, and neither one cancels out the other. The man who spent 4 decades making sure he was never the reason anyone's day got worse is the same man who eventually decided some days he had to be exactly that. That's the contradiction sitting underneath this whole story. A man built almost entirely around not disappointing people, who had to learn how to do it on purpose. Terry tunes pianos for a living, has for 31 years, ever since a music teacher at his old high school noticed he could hear a note was flat before he could explain why. He carries his tools in a canvas roll his father gave him, the leather straps replaced twice, the case older than his daughter. He works alone most days, driving from church basements to funeral homes to living rooms where an old upright hasn't been touched since somebody's grandmother passed. It's quiet work, the kind that rewards patience and punishes shortcuts, and Terry is good at both. When a piano comes to him out of tune, he doesn't force it back into place all at once, because a string pulled too hard will just slip again by morning. He brings it up in small turns, checks it, lets it settle, comes back to it. For years, that's exactly how he treated people too, easing them toward what he needed instead of ever just saying it, adjusting himself in small turns so nobody around him ever felt the strain. Terry grew up on the east side of Cleveland in the 1970s. In a house 2 blocks from the rail line, in a neighborhood that still had a rhythm built around shift changes at the mill. His father, Earl, worked the furnace floor at a steel plant that employed half the fathers on their street, the kind of job that was supposed to last a lifetime. It didn't. By 1982, when Terry was 14, the layoffs had worked their way from the newer hires to men who'd been there 20 years, and Earl's name came up on a list nobody in the house wanted to talk about. Sociologist William Julius Wilson spent years documenting what happened to neighborhoods like Terry's when manufacturing work disappeared from American cities in the 1970s and 80s, describing how black workers were often hit first and hardest both, because many had gained factory access more recently through civil rights-era anti-discrimination pushes, and because fewer had savings or family wealth to soften the fall. That's not abstract history for Terry. That's the specific week his father stopped setting an alarm. Terry remembers exactly how much louder the house felt at 6 in the morning without the sound of his father getting ready. Nobody sat Terry down and explained what unemployment meant for a black man in his 40s in a shrinking Rust Belt city in 1982, but he understood the shape of it anyway, the way kids understand weather before they understand meteorology. He watched his father apply to jobs that went to younger white men with less experience, watched him take work that paid a third of what the mill had, watched him come home some nights too tired to be disappointed, and other nights too disappointed to be tired. None of this was only emotional, either. Federal Reserve research has long pointed to a substantial gap in accumulated wealth between black and white households in America, a gap that tends to widen rather than narrow during downturns like the one that hit Cleveland's steel industry. For a family like the Boykins, that gap wasn't a chart in a report. It was the difference between Earl finding new work in 6 weeks or 6 months, between a missed mortgage payment and a manageable one. Terry grew up watching how thin the margin for error actually was, and thin margins produce careful people, the kind who triple-check a lunch order before they ever consider asking for a favor. Saturday mornings in the Boykin house always had a soundtrack. His father moving through chores with Teddy Pendergrass or Marvin Gaye turned up loud enough to reach the backyard. It was one of the only times all week Earl looked unguarded, singing along off-key while he raked leaves or fixed the porch step, and Terry noticed even then that his father's shoulders dropped a little every time the music was on. Nobody explained that connection to him either. He just filed it away. Work hard, keep your face steady, and find 20 minutes on a Saturday to let the mask down where nobody's really watching. What Terry took from that year wasn't a lecture, it was a policy. Don't add weight to a house that's already carrying too much. He started making his own lunch, then his sister's. There's a specific memory Terry still carries from that year, sharper than most. He needed new sneakers for the fall, the kind every kid needed, and he stood in his room doing the math out loud in his head before he ever said a word to his mother. He decided the answer was no before anyone had a chance to actually say it, wore his old pair with a split seam through most of 9th grade, and told anyone who asked that he liked them better broken in. Nobody in his house ever told him to do that math. He just did it quietly the way he'd keep doing it for the next 40 years. By 16, "I'm fine" was the fastest thing out of his mouth in almost any situation, whether or not it was true. Researchers have a name for what a lot of black men of Terry's generation learned to do in households like his. Public health researcher Sherman James spent years studying what he called John Henryism, the pattern of meeting chronic stress and limited resources with sustained, high-effort coping, working harder and showing less strain rather than less. James found that this strategy could carry real physical costs over time, showing up later in elevated rates of hypertension among the men who relied on it most, particularly when the effort wasn't matched by real economic reward. In plain terms, the harder Terry's father pushed to look unbothered, the more that composure was quietly taxing his body, even as it protected the household from one more thing to worry about. Terry inherited the strategy without ever hearing the term for it, because nobody names a coping mechanism while they're using it to survive. Pew Research has described Gen X more broadly as a self-reliant, often overlooked generation, shaped by rising divorce rates, more households with both parents working, and a childhood that produced a lot of kids who let themselves into empty houses after school. Layer race, a shrinking industrial economy, and a father who just lost the job that anchored the family's sense of stability on top of that generational pattern. And you get a kid who learned self-reliance as something closer to a survival skill than a personality trait. Terry wasn't unusually agreeable by nature. He was accurately reading a house, and later a world, where his own needs registered as a risk that somebody else would have to absorb. Terry's specific version of that inheritance came with its own domestic comedy, because these things always do. To this day, he will drive across town to fix a leaking faucet himself rather than call a plumber, not because he can't afford one, but because asking somebody to fix something in his own house still feels vaguely like reporting a failure. Simone still teases him about the summer he retiled the bathroom floor himself over a long weekend, instead of admitting the job was bigger than a Saturday, ending up with a bathroom that was serviceable level and took 4 months longer than a professional would have needed. "You'd rather regret for a year," she told him, "than let somebody see you need help for a week." Terry laughed at that because it was funny, and because it was also exactly true, which is usually how the best jokes about people work. That risk calculation didn't stay in his childhood home, it moved with him. By his 20s, Terry had become the man everyone in his circle called first, not because he had the most time, but because he almost never told them he didn't. He tuned the piano at his church for free for 11 years before anyone thought to ask if he'd rather be paid, mostly because he never let the question surface. He still leaves voicemails nobody under 40 listens to, a full, formal message every time, like he's leaving testimony rather than a note. Simone has given up asking him to just text, because some habits, she's decided, aren't worth the fight, and this one, at least, is harmless. His even keel isn't just a personality quirk, it's part of what makes him good at his job. 2 summers ago, he was hired to tune a piano for a wedding reception 3 hours before the ceremony, only to find the venue's air conditioning had failed, and the instrument had swollen half a step flat in the heat. The wedding planner was close to tears, the bride's mother was hovering, and the room felt like it was one more problem away from falling apart. Terry didn't raise his voice, didn't rush, just opened his tool roll and started working the piano back into tune in careful, patient turns, the same way he'd learned to bring any tense room down a few degrees. By the time the first guests arrived, the piano was in tune, and so, more or less, was the room. That skill, staying calm while everyone around him unravels a little, has built his entire professional reputation. It's also the exact same skill that let him absorb 30 years of other people's emergencies, without ever once handing one back. At his cousin's repast one summer, an aunt cornered him near the food table and said what half the family believed. "Terry's the reliable one, thank God, because Lord knows the rest of us would fall apart." She meant it as a compliment, and Terry took it as one for years, the way you'd take a job title. What she didn't see was the math running underneath it, the same math that had run in his father's kitchen decades earlier. Better to absorb the inconvenience yourself than risk becoming one. Every trait that made Terry easy to love also came with a bill attached, and reliability was the clearest example. Strength. People trusted him completely, built plans around him, gave him responsibility because he'd never once let it drop. Cost. Almost nobody in his life had practiced imagining a version of Terry who might say no, which meant nobody built in room for one. Black men of Terry's generation grew up inside a specific set of unwritten instructions about how to be seen by people outside the family. Show up early, speak carefully, don't give anybody a reason to say you were difficult, because difficult could cost you a job, a loan, a chance, in ways it rarely cost a white coworker doing the exact same thing. Terry's oldest friend, Marcus, still cuts his hair every third Saturday in the same shop they've gone to since they were teenagers. Marcus, clippers buzzing, once told him, "You know you're the only one of us who never asks the shop for a favor, right?" Terry hadn't thought about it that way, but Marcus was right. He'd pay full price for a $2 trim rather than let anyone feel like they owed him nothing in return. "Man, I don't want to owe nobody nothing," Terry said, and Marcus just shook his head and kept cutting, because he'd heard some version of that sentence from Terry for 30 years. Being easy to work with wasn't just a personality trait for men like Terry. It was armor, a way of controlling how much risk your presence carried in rooms where the margin for error wasn't the same for everybody. That armor is efficient, and it's also exhausting to wear for 40 years, because armor doesn't come off just because the threat that justified it has faded. Therapists who work with trauma responses have increasingly used a fourth category alongside fight, flight, and freeze, one popularized by clinician Pete Walker: fawning, the instinct to keep the people around you calm and pleased as a way of staying safe. It's not weakness, and it's not really about liking people too much. It's a nervous system doing exactly what it learned worked. Psychologist Wisdom Powell Hammond, who has spent much of her career studying black men's health, has pointed out that masculinity norms in many black communities are often shaped by environments where showing strain wasn't just discouraged, it was genuinely risky. Her research links that suppress strain to men avoiding doctors, avoiding therapy, avoiding almost anything that requires saying, "I'm not okay," out loud. The American Psychological Association's annual Stress in America surveys have repeatedly found that Black adults report higher levels of stress tied to systemic and financial pressures than the national average, even accounting for income. Terry's father carried that stress silently, and Terry, without ever choosing to, learned to carry other people's potential disappointment the same way. Here's the part that reframes almost everything that came before it. What looked like a soft, agreeable personality was actually one of the most disciplined risk management systems a person can build, running quietly for 40 years without ever once being named out loud. Terry wasn't easygoing because disappointing people didn't matter to him. He was easygoing because, for most of his life, it mattered more than almost anything else. Terry isn't an unusual case among men of his generation. He's a fairly representative one. Talk to enough Black Gen X men and you'll hear versions of the same story. A childhood shaped by economic instability or family strain, a lesson learned early about the cost of adding friction, and a middle-aged moment often triggered by health divorce or simple exhaustion. When the old strategy stops paying for itself, not every man reaches that moment, and the ones who do rarely reach it the same way or at the same age. But the underlying architecture, competence and composure built to manage risk rather than simply express personality, shows up often enough that psychologists studying Black masculinity treat it as a recognizable pattern rather than a coincidence. Terry's specific instrument was a piano, but the tuning metaphor could just as easily have been a different job, a different city, a different decade. The cost of running that system for decades doesn't show up all at once, it shows up as erosion. Terry's marriage to Denise lasted 19 years, and by the last 3, she'd started finishing his sentences with the answer she knew was coming before he opened his mouth. "You'll say yes," she told him once, not unkindly, "and then you'll be mad about it in your own head for a week, and I won't even know why." She wasn't wrong. Psychologist Dana Jack, whose research on self-silencing focused mostly on women, described a pattern worth borrowing here anyway. People who consistently suppress their own needs to preserve a relationship's peace often end up feeling more distant from the very people they're protecting, not closer. Terry's version of that wasn't about preserving peace with Denise specifically. It was a reflex built years before he ever met her, but the effect Jack described showed up in his marriage anyway. The more he managed his own disappointment silently, the less Denise felt like she actually knew him, even after 19 years in the same house. Terry could tell you the exact temperature of a room by the third measure of a song, but he couldn't tell his own wife he was tired without dressing it up as something else first. Resentment doesn't announce itself. It accumulates the way dust does on the inside of a piano nobody's opened in years, invisible until somebody finally lifts the lid. By the time Terry and Denise separated, the actual argument that ended it was almost beside the point, because the real argument had been building since a kitchen in 1982. Their daughter Simone was 17 when they split, old enough to notice her father apologizing to the moving truck driver for asking him to park somewhere else, on the day he was leaving his own marriage. Simone spent her 20s watching her father give pieces of himself away to people who never seemed to notice the transaction. She'd call him from Columbus, where she works now as a school counselor, and ask why he'd driven 2 hours to help a cousin move furniture on the one weekend he'd said he was going to rest. "Because he asked," Terry would tell her, like that settled it, and for a long time it did. Simone started naming it before Terry did, gently at first, then less gently. "You're not actually being generous, Dad," she told him one Sunday, sitting in his kitchen while he iced a piano hammer he'd chipped. "You're just scared of what happens if you're not." Terry didn't argue with her, which was its own kind of admission. He'd spent his whole career listening for the exact moment a note stopped being true, and his daughter had just played one he couldn't unhear. It wasn't lost on Terry that his daughter spends her workdays teaching teenagers the exact skill he'd spent his whole life avoiding. Simone runs a small group at her school, half-jokingly called Boundaries 101, where 14-year-olds practice saying no to friends without immediately apologizing for it. She told her father once that watching him growing up was part of why she does that work in the first place. that she'd grown up wanting to hand some other kid's father a shortcut to the version of himself Terry only found in his 50s. Terry didn't know whether to feel proud or indicted, so for once, he let himself feel both at the same time. The turn, when it finally came, didn't arrive as a speech or a decision Terry announced to anybody. It arrived in a doctor's office, in a blood pressure reading that made the nurse take it twice. Terry was 54, otherwise healthy, and the doctor asked him a question nobody in his life had ever asked so directly. "What are you carrying that you haven't put down?" Terry sat with that question longer than he sat with most things, because he genuinely didn't know how to answer it. He thought about his father's silence, about the mill, about 30 years of pianos tuned for free, about Denise finishing his sentences, about Simone's voice in his kitchen. He didn't have a single answer. He had a pattern, and once he saw the pattern, he couldn't stop seeing it. 3 weeks later, his sister called asking for money for the 4th time that year, and Terry, for the first time in his adult life, said no, without immediately explaining himself into a yes. She was quiet on the phone for a second, then annoyed, then she hung up faster than usual. Terry sat with the discomfort of that instead of chasing her down to fix it, which was new, and which felt less like relief and more like holding his breath underwater. Nothing about Terry's character flipped overnight, and it's worth being honest about that, because the story of a man finally standing up for himself makes for a cleaner video than real life ever produces. He still shows up for the people who matter to him, still tunes the church piano more often than he technically should, still drives 2 hours for Simone without blinking. What changed is smaller and harder to film. He started leaving a half-second of silence before he answered a request, long enough to actually check whether he had the room for it. Sometimes the answer is still yes, and sometimes now it's genuinely no, delivered without an apology tour attached to it. His sister stopped calling as often, which stung for a while and then quietly stopped stinging. 2 cousins have called him different to his face, meaning it as a complaint, and Terry has learned to let that land without rushing to fix it either. A regular client once asked him to reschedule a Tuesday appointment to a Sunday afternoon, the one block of the week Terry now protects without exception. He said no, offered 2 other times, and didn't spend the rest of the day rehearsing an apology in his head the way he once would have. The client rescheduled without complaint, which surprised Terry more than it probably should have, given how rarely anyone had ever actually tested what would happen if he held a line. Even now, 3 years into this new version of himself, Terry catches the old reflex mid-motion more often than he'd like to admit. A younger tuner he sometimes mentors offered to carry his tool roll up a flight of stairs last spring, and Terry's first instinct was to wave him off before his own knees had even finished complaining. He caught himself, said actually, yeah, thanks, and let the kid carry it, which felt small and also felt like proof that the work was real. Change like this doesn't announce itself with fireworks, it shows up in a stairwell, in 4 extra words a man almost didn't say. He's not colder, he's just no longer running the same 40-year-old risk assessment on every small request that lands in front of him. Terry doesn't know if Simone will ever fully unlearn the version of this pattern she inherited from watching him, because habits like this rarely skip a generation cleanly. What he can do now, and what he tries to do every time she calls, is answer honestly instead of automatically, so that at least the example she's copying from him has changed. If there's a lesson in Terry's story for the people who love a man like him, it's this. The version of him that says yes to everything isn't more loving than the version who sometimes says no, he's just more afraid. Real trust, the kind that survives 50 years instead of just looking good at a repass, has room in it for somebody's honest limits. There's a specific moment in tuning a piano when a string that's been dragged too sharp for years finally settles back to where it should sit, and it doesn't ring louder, it rings truer. That's closer to what happened to Terry than any dramatic reinvention. He didn't become somebody new in his 50s. He became less willing to keep muting the note that was already there. Back in that dining room in Shaker Heights, after he sent his sister those 4 words and put the phone face down, Terry picked the tuning fork back up out of habit. He struck it once, more out of reflex than need, and let it ring the way he always does, all the way down to silence on its own time, without reaching over to stop it early. For most of his life, Terry thought his job, and maybe his purpose, was making sure nothing around him ever stayed out of tune for long. What he knows now, standing in rooms that don't belong to him, hands still smelling of felt and metal, is that some notes are allowed to just be flat for a while, including his own. If you've ever wondered why the most dependable man in your family got quieter and harder to reach somewhere in his 50s, you've just heard one version of why. There's another side to this same story worth watching next. The men who never got there at all.